Welcome to the klutchkittengaming podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone, this is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad that you're here for episode 51 of the show. We're on the back half of our road to 100 episodes, and it feels great. The exciting thing for me is that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. Trust me, I hear my voice enough. I would not keep doing the show if you weren't listening. So thanks a ton for the support. Apart from listening, the best ways that you can support the show are through having your 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and by telling your friends. Having a good rating on iTunes is obviously a boon for the show, but if someone doesn't even know where to look, the rating doesn't do that much. That's why telling your friends is super important. In the news this week, we have something that a lot of people expected at some point, but I think it was a shock that it came so quickly. GameStop laid off over 120 people, and what surprised me most were the layoffs at Game Informer. If you weren't already aware, Game Informer magazine has been a subsidiary of GameStop for a time now, so a portion of that crew ended up being on the chopping block in this round of firings. One GameStop spokesperson said the following: "As part of our previously announced GameStop Reboot initiative to transform our business for the future and improve our financial performance, we can confirm a workplace reduction was implemented, impacting more than 120 corporate staff positions, representing approximately 14% of our total associate base at our company headquarters as well as some other offices." Although it definitely sucks that so many people were laid off in the GameStop side, for me it really blows to hear about all the editors at Game Informer that were let go. I'm a religious follower of the GI show, the Game Informer podcast, and I've been subscribing to the magazine for around 2 years now. Through that podcast, I feel like I've gotten to know so many of those individuals, and their loss at that company will definitely be felt. That being said, I don't want to talk about these people like they died or something. My hope is that they all land on their feet with another job in the games industry, and that they continue to bring value to the space elsewhere. Let's move on now to this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about Mutant Year Zero: Road to Eden, which is a tactical adventure game designed by the Bearded Ladies. It was released on December 4th of 2018 for PC, PS4, and Xbox One, and it just recently released on Switch on July 30th of 2019. The Bearded Ladies is a development studio based in Sweden, which was founded by former IO Interactive developers. In addition to Mutant Year Zero, this team has put out a couple other small games called Landit Bandit and Pipe Madness. Mutant Year Zero currently costs $34.99. If you were keeping an eye on the Epic Game Store giveaways, it was actually free for a short time as well. According to HowLongToBeat.com, Mutant Year Zero seems to take around 16.5 hours to beat for the average player, and in terms of controls, I personally used my mouse and keyboard, but I can totally see how a controller would work decently well. In general, I always recommend mouse and keyboard for these types of turn-based tactics games, but since Mutant Year Zero uses a real-time movement mechanic between battles, it actually makes the controller a bit more appealing. I didn't try my Xbox 360 controller, but I wouldn't be too worried about having a subpar experience if gamepad is all that you have. Let's move on now to the narrative. You know all that talk about nuclear war? Countries poised with their fingers on the trigger? The insane thing is that all of those countries couldn't look past their own pride and ego enough to realize that those guns were held up to their own heads. Does it really matter who shot first if everyone dies in the end? Luckily for me, I wasn't around back then. I'm a product of the future. And it's not the shining future they used to write about in sci-fi books. My world is a radiated wasteland full of crazy ghouls and fucking depressed people. I take up residence in the last bastion of hope, the Ark. There are always rumors of other survivors, but few souls have made it far from these gates. I'm a special mutant called a Stalker, but that pretty much just means I can handle the gun well enough to go out and fetch resources for the colony. Life is pretty grim. At least it was until all the recent events with Hammond. Mutant Year Zero starts you out playing two Stalkers. Borman, a humanoid boar, and Dux, well, a humanoid duck. After your time collecting resources for the Ark, you return only to find out that the genius, Hammond, and his entire crew disappeared during their latest expedition. They were seen headed north, but no one knows where they ended up. One interesting thing to note about this game is that it's based on the Swedish tabletop RPG that goes by the same name. I haven't played it myself, but I definitely got the sense that there's a lot of lore behind the story I was playing through. That was actually a surprise to me since I come from a heavy background in XCOM, where the story is pretty much inconsequential. There are aliens and they're trying to take over, but I could care less as long as there are interesting enemies to fight. In Mutant Year Zero, the bearded ladies do a lot to try and flesh out the world and characters that you interact with. Not only are there some pretty lengthy cutscenes with background and lore, but your characters talk quite a bit while you're walking around. And there are also quite a few artifacts that you can find with pretty funny descriptions. For example, you find a boombox pretty early on that Dux mistakenly thinks was a bomb back in the day. He says that all you have to do is push the red button, and boom, you're all dead. Similarly, when you find an old iPod Classic, you know that chunky one with the Apple logo on the back, the description is that it's a device used to check the ripeness of fruit. A side benefit, of course, is that it can also play music. For me, those conversations between characters and those descriptions of items like the iPod really added charm to the game. In terms of the overarching plot and world, it's not particularly creative, but it was still compelling enough. It's not the first time a post-apocalyptic game with religious fanatics and zombies has been done, but the trek after a mysterious disappearance intrigued me enough to keep pushing forward. Before we move on, I want to mention one downside to this more narrative-focused approach, at least in this type of game. Having named characters with specific dialogue is great in terms of fleshing out those characters. The aspect I found myself missing, however, was the emergent storytelling that's prolific in a game like XCOM. In XCOM, you're encouraged to take advantage of the character creator. You're supposed to create a squad of your best friends, or the Avengers, or the A-Team. For me, I created a squad with myself and my wife and family, which ended up developing those emergent storytelling situations within battles. I found myself actually playing the game differently because of my emotional attachment to those characters I created. The characters in Mutant Year Zero all have their own pre-scripted personalities before you even start the game, which really limits the amount of emergent storytelling that can be developed. This dichotomy is obviously nothing new in gaming. There's a reason some games have silent protagonists and others have voiced protagonists. There's a reason some games allow you to customize your character and others don't. For me personally, I appreciate the ability to create characters in games like this, but let's not hold that against the bearded ladies too much. They made a narrative decision, and I think they followed through with it pretty well. Let's take a look now at the gameplay. I need to preface my analysis by saying that I was incredibly hyped for this game. I have a deep love for XCOM, so I was hooked at the very mention of this being an indie XCOM-like. Unfortunately, I was left with a pretty bad taste in my mouth after experiencing the gameplay. But before we talk more about that, let's discuss how this game actually flows. Right off the bat, when you boot up the game, especially if you're an XCOM or even Mario vs. Rabbids veteran, you'll notice that your characters aren't standing in a grid-based arena. You can freely move your two characters around the environment. Mario vs. Rabbids does do this a bit in the sense that you're freely moving from battle to battle, but Mutant Year Zero takes it a step further. Unlike XCOM and Mario Rabbids, where the bulk of the gameplay is found in the tactical fights, a pretty large portion of this game is found in the exploration around relatively large arenas. The arenas aren't so big that you'll be wandering around for 30 minutes, but you're encouraged to scout as much as you can because it allows you to find scrap and loot, and it also gives you the tactical advantage if and when you choose to engage enemies. On that front, you can move around in two modes. If you have your flashlight on, you move around more quickly, but enemies will be able to spot you from further away. If you have your flashlight off, you move slower, but enemies have a smaller detection radius. Unlike XCOM, where you can accidentally trigger pods of enemies by moving too recklessly into the fog of war, in this game, it's very clear whether or not you're moving into a location that will get you spotted, at least in the context of that real-time movement. When it comes to engaging in battle, this is where the grid-based, tactical gameplay starts. At any point, you can push a button to ambush an enemy, and that activates combat. Assuming you actually ambushed an enemy and weren't just spotted, you get the first move. From there, in terms of the broad strokes, combat is about what you'd expect. Similarly, progression is pretty typical with gear and skills. Over the course of the game, you unlock 5 playable characters, which each specialize in different types of weapons, and who all have mostly unique skill trees. As your characters level up, you can upgrade things like health and speed, or you can unlock more interesting cooldown tied abilities like Skull Splitter for ducks, which gives a 100% crit chance, but which reduces your accuracy by 25%. So I really want to get into the nitty gritty of each of these elements, but I think our time would be better spent looking at some key strengths and weaknesses of the gameplay. The first strength has to do with the unique flow between real-time and turn-based gameplay. There's a pretty big focus on stealth in the sense that you can pick off enemies if they're isolated from the rest of the pack. If you set up an ambush on an isolated enemy and kill that person with stealth weapons before they have a chance to alert their allies, you'll be popped back up into the real-time movement mode. It's odd to exit the turn-based strategy combat after just killing one enemy, but it's a super key strategy if you want to play this game well. The second strength of gameplay has to do with the convenience of real-time movement and stealth. Often your first 3 to 5 turns in XCOM consist strictly of movement and setup. Although setup is incredibly important, those turns can be slow and tedious. Instead of having to deal with that in Mutant Year Zero, you can instead position your characters in real time without having to go through the slog of turn order. You're able to position a character, make them hide, which essentially immunizes them from detection, and then you can set up your remaining 2 characters. The third strength that stands out to me is weapon swapping. Each character can take 2 primary weapons into combat, which makes it possible to diversify your loadout and, in a way, hedge your bets. Instead of upgrading only one weapon and piling all of your attachments onto that one gun, you have the option to diversify and upgrade 2 guns so that you're prepared for more of what you could face. All of those strengths are cool and really help set this game apart from the likes of Mario Rabbids and XCOM. However, Mutant Year Zero is definitely not without its flaws. The first weakness is that the very moment you're spotted or heard, all of the enemies in an area start to converge on you. I think the developers were hoping players would methodically pick off enough enemies so that the remainder would be a reasonable force to face, but this never seemed to happen. I'm no expert at these types of games, but I'm also not a slouch either. I was usually able to pick off 1 or 2 enemies before I was heard, but once I was spotted, all hell would break loose. What was incredibly frustrating was that enemies that were seemingly across the entire map would come over and attack me. XCOM addresses this by having pods of enemies placed around the map. When you engage a pod, it doesn't alert other groups of enemies or other pods unless they're within view of that battle. In Mutant Year Zero, skirmishes felt like an all or nothing sort of thing, and oftentimes there were just way too many enemies to try and take down. This leads us to our second weakness: difficulty. When you first boot up the game, you have the option of choosing between normal, hard, and insane, or whatever it is they call it. It described hard as a difficulty for players who are familiar with the turn-based tactics genre. Naturally, I chose that difficulty level only to drop it down to normal very soon after. Even after I turned it down to normal, I was still having an incredibly hard time trying to fight through these battles. It was ridiculous. Since my ego was obviously hurt by having a hard time on normal, I looked online and in other reviews to see if this was a common issue. I was happy to see, and I felt vindicated, that I wasn't the only one. The crazy thing is that I didn't even try the hardest difficulty or enable the permadeath option, and I'm glad that I didn't. My game would have been over in the first freaking level. My core issue isn't the fact that this is a brutally difficult game. My issue is that the difficulty is tied to inherent design flaws. The last weakness I'll mention is the accuracy system. This is an interesting one because many people criticize XCOM for this very thing. There are memes about missing a shot with a 98% chance to hit. There are animations where your character is literally swinging an axe at a sectoid's face and somehow they miss. I think the developers of Mutant Year Zero may have wanted to avoid that whole realm of stupidity, but instead of finding a new way to quantify hit probability, they just simplified the system. Accuracy in Mutant Year Zero is measured in 25% increments. So you either can't see an enemy, or you have a 25, 50, 75, or 100% chance to hit. You might be wondering, why is this a weakness? It sounds like it's a more simple and maybe clean system. Well, for me, despite how infuriating missing a 98% chance shot is, I think it's actually an enhancement to the game. You might be asking yourself now, does it really make a difference if you have a 51% chance versus a 50% chance? I would argue yes. And I do because those percentages are part of what create that emergent storytelling I was talking about earlier. 50% is literally just a coin flip, whereas if I have a 51% chance or even a 50.5% chance, that's still a small glimmer of hope, which makes me feel like I'm in control. The thing that doesn't make sense to me is that limiting accuracy to 4 options doesn't actually take away those highs or lows. It just removes those story-creating moments. Wow, I talked way too much about gameplay, so let's move on now to the art and sound design. When it comes to the visuals, they're pretty decent overall. When you're in the isometric view within levels, the environment and characters look good. They never looked amazing, but I also wasn't gawking in disgust because of crappy animations or anything like that. On the other hand, when it comes to cutscenes or basically any place where you see the face and body details, the graphics really start to break down. They straight up look bad in some instances. That being said, if top-notch graphics were the most important thing to you, I don't think you'd be listening to a podcast about indie games. We'll cut the bearded ladies a little bit of slack on this front because high-quality 3D character models aren't cheap to build out. On the VO front, this was very interesting. The 2 main characters you start out with, Borman and Dux, were voiced by Enzo Scalino Jr. and Jared Zeus. I think they did a superb job, and I was incredibly surprised that they were both fully voice-acted characters. There were some cheesy moments, but both of the actors brought life and emotion to the characters. Where the VO dropped off a damn cliff for me, though, was with the enemy voice acting. Some of the boss-like characters had passable VO, but oh my gosh, when I first heard the ghouls, I thought I had been transported to Middle Earth. Half of them sounded like good old Gollum. Literally one of them said, "We wants it, we needs it." Maybe the developers are huge Tolkien fans and wanted to incorporate their fandom into the game, but I was cringing at the enemies most of the time they were talking. It was brutal. When it comes to the soundtrack, it wasn't anything crazy, but it wasn't meant to be a focal point. Most of the songs were there as atmospheric enhancers, and they seemed to do the trick. They were mysterious, quiet, ominous, and fit the environment well. Now that we've made it through the narrative, gameplay, art, and sound design, let's summarize with some positives and negatives. First off, on the positive side, I really liked all of the collectible descriptions and the small conversations between characters while walking around. Those are the areas where the writing felt especially fresh and playful. Second, the mix of real-time exploration with turn-based tactics was intriguing and clever. It helped cut out the annoying tedium of turn-based positioning, and it added a unique layer of strategy. Third, the voice actors did a great job of bringing life to the primary characters. First off, on the negative side, I hated the way that enemies across the map would come after you if an enemy 10 yards away became aware of your presence. It led to gameplay that relied on save scumming and turtling out long, grindy fights. Second, I think the simplification of the accuracy system was a detriment to the overall feeling of combat. Third, the basic enemy VO was so cheesy and dumb that it took me out of the experience. It would have been so much better for the game if it wasn't even there. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I let you know whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict for Mutant Year Zero is to flee this game. Now, there is a chance that the DLC has fixed some of the issues I have, but based on what I played in the base game, I would not purchase this for $35. I could be taking a harsher perspective than this game deserves, but it's hard to recommend this when XCOM 2 and XCOM 2 War of the Chosen go on sale for the same price or less multiple times a year. I got this game for free from Epic, and I don't ever see myself going back to it unless some serious improvements are made. As always, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen in. I know it's not always the most fun to listen to someone rail on a game for 20 minutes straight, but I hope you found value in my review. If you agree or even disagree with my thoughts, I would love to hear why. You can email me at klutchkittengaming@gmail.com, or you can DM me on Instagram at klutchkittengaming. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in game.